Wesleyan, and I want to welcome you all to the faculty lecture series. It's hosted by the Honors Program, the Office of the Dean, and we are so lucky to be here at Argo Books, such a beautiful place to get off campus and do some cool stuff, so we thank you as well. I am terrible at introductions. This is not my forte. We were just talking, I can lecture in front of all the people, but getting up here and being so good is sometimes nerve-wracking. So let me tell you, I have the distinct pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Ashley Lawson. It's especially fun because she is my boss and my friend, and I'm really glad to be here introducing her. So Ashley is an associate professor and chair of the English department at West Virginia Wesleyan College. Her research and teaching centers on early to mid 20th century American literature with a special focus on women writers. In addition to her new book that she'll be reading from tonight, she has published in the collections Shirley Jackson and Domesticity Beyond the Haunted House, and The Romance of Regionalism in the works of F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, as well as the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Shirley Jackson. Her work has also appeared in the journals Shirley Jackson Studies, the Journal for Modern Periodical Studies, and the Fitzgerald Review. I have to tell you quickly that Ashley added a little tagline onto the end of her email, which I think is wildly appropriate. She said that she always wants to add something like, quote, on weekends, she enjoys drinking the blood of her enemies. So I would give her a large round of applause to welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. I just want to make sure you're paying attention, right? Like, I just want to get your attention. Well, thank you to Argo, to my colleague John, and thank you to all the students and colleagues who are here. I think academia gets a rap for being kind of competitive and cutthroat, but throughout this whole process, I never felt anything but supported by the people I work with and the students. And there were times when I was feeling really stressed out, and everyone else's kindness and joy sort of reminded me, like, I was really thankful to get the chance to do this. So I'm so honored to have all of you here tonight and sharing this with me. Here's hoping I don't disappoint you and your expectations. Okay, so the book is set up in a way that makes it a little annoying for reading from it. So I have an introduction that introduces the writers, and then I've got my first chapter, which is about gender and genre, and then every chapter after that is about a different genre. So I thought what I do is I pick and choose a little bit from the introduction and the first chapter about gender and genre, and then if we still have some time, I can just talk quickly about one example of the genres, just to give you a sense of how I approach things from there. So hopefully all the cutting and stitching together I did will make some sort of sense. All right, so I'm going to start with the introduction. In June 1943, Patricia Highsmith tagged along with a friend on a social call to the Greenwich Village apartment of Stanley Edgar Hyman and his wife Shirley Jackson. Highsmith's interest was mostly in Hyman, whose employer, The New Yorker, had a frustrating habit of rejecting her story submissions. But the brief description of the event she recorded later in her diary focuses instead on her conversation with his wife. Highsmith, just 22 years old, was struggling to make ends meet by writing for comic book publishers, whereas the 26-year-old Jackson had already placed several short stories in respective publications. And so while Highsmith found Hyman to be horrible, she grudgingly admitted that Jackson was all right. As the two drank coffee together, Highsmith reportedly told Jackson about her own work, and the more seasoned writer apparently gave the newbie a much appreciated advice about acquiring an agent. This otherwise uneventful meeting warrants a mention in a 2009 biography of Highsmith because, though these writers have rarely been directly compared to one another, upon further consideration, the similarity between their work is strikingly obvious. The biographer notes as a primary point of connection Jackson's interest in the same psychological states which obsessed Pat, but the professional parallels between these women extend much further. Both explored a relatively cohesive set of themes in a wide variety of literary forms, ranging from children's books to science fiction to mysteries. And despite their reputations as masters of suspense, both also had cantankerous and sometimes decidedly unfeminine, at least by mid-century American standards, personalities that added an underlying, often subversive sense of humor to their writing. Each produced a body of work that has been described both as outside of its time and of its time, and their literary legacies were neglected until relatively recently when, with the rise of feminist criticism and queer studies, each experienced a renaissance. For scholars today, then, this encounter is more than just a trivial anecdote of literary history. The meeting of two great female creative minds so early in their respective careers suggests the tantalizing possibility of a very different narrative of post-war American literature, one that foregrounds the contributions of female writers and emphasizes a network of personal and professional connections between them. By studying these authors alongside Leigh Brackett, another mid-century multi-genre writer whose legacy has been neglected, I hope to demonstrate the significant influence of women writers in the post-war era. In addition to highlighting gender influences, I will emphasize the way assumptions about genre, another important category of meaning, shaped critical perceptions of post-war publishing and its writers, thereby making the biases of this era visible. Though there are a number of significant similarities between these authors' literary interests, most important for this study is the fact that all three took fluid and creative approaches to genre writing. Jackson's distinctive fusion of various formats was her greatest strength, but also a liability within an industry that preferred clear, simple, or simplistic marketing narratives. Conversely, Highsmith was snared in just one of these categories, that of crime or suspense writer, and was never able to escape the burdens of such a designation. Brackett was perhaps most disadvantaged by genre biases, as she was a master of the pulpiest form of two marginally respected genres, crime and science fiction. Yet all three writers, in part because of these associations, have been assessed mostly in comparison to male genre writers. For example, Jackson's Gothic approach has been considered against that of predecessors like Henry James' Turn of the Screw. Highsmith is frequently grouped with Jim Thompson as crime writers who defied genre norms of their era and thus influenced many authors to come. And Leigh Brackett is compared to Black Mask crime writers, usually Raymond Chandler, or for her science fiction, her husband Edmund Hamilton or her protege Ray Bradbury. Consequently, grouping these women writers upends narratives of literary influence and highlights more subtle elements of their treatment of gender, especially for Highsmith and Brackett, who were writing primarily in masculinized genres. Importantly, Brackett's and Highsmith's strong genre associations may have also disadvantaged them in another way. As feminist critics have sought to rewrite literary history, female writers whose work seems to hew more closely to the often misogynist standards of their time period and genres were mostly left out of this process of reclamation. Because Highsmith and Brackett utilized male protagonists, as did most crime and sci-fi writers of this period, feminist critics have been too quick to assume their work adheres to a misogynist status quo. Instead, by foregrounding the influence of genre, I will argue that both authors were aware of these conventions, but sought to bend the framework to fit a more subversive purpose, one that focused on the way contemporary society, whether represented by a suburban small town or an intergalactic space colony, promoted restrictive gender roles that were often harmful to both sexes. Taking a broader, more inclusive view of literary production during the post-war era, one that includes more than just realist fiction written by white, mostly straight men, a new picture is revealed that adds depth and breadth to the version of literary history as it is traditionally described in scholarship and textbooks. Those who seek to expand this view struggle to advocate for the worth of writers who do not meet the rather narrow qualifications of merit as they have been traditionally applied. Such criteria reinforce assumptions about the self-evident worth of these writers and make it difficult to add anyone new to the list, even as we become more aware of the biases embedded in our methods, especially those, I argue, of gender and genre. Even 50 years of recovery efforts by feminist critics, the first generation of whom came of age during this period, has done little to shift the image of post-war literature as an era defined by male authors and the verisimilar or realist novel. Yet grouping these three very different writers together, we can illuminate new patterns of women's writing at mid-century that have been previously obscured. Specifically, each of these authors developed a distinctive suspense-forward style that playfully merged elements from multiple genres, a technique that was meant to reflect a growing sense that the world was more dangerous than even the pervasive Cold War hysteria of the time reflected, though in ways that the more explicit political propaganda ignored. They merged the dominant mode of literary realism with elements of genre writing to respond to the big questions of their era with startling and unnerving answers that inevitably produced even more queries and that perfectly illustrated the tension that defined the age of anxiety. In addition to their genre connections, other striking similarities within this trio's biography encourage fruitful comparisons. All three women were born within 6 years of each other between 1915 and 1921 and grew up in middle class or upper middle class homes. They all had access to the kind of quality education that was becoming increasingly available to women and a certain degree of family support. Brackett and Jackson both married fellow writers, the marriage photos there, and each was arguably more successful than her surprisingly supportive partner. All three of these writers also chose authorship as a vocation from a very young age, and they pursued their desired professional career with dogged determination. Brackett began writing at age 9 by imagining sequels to her favorite films, but she began her serious work at age 13. She sold her first story to the pulp magazine Astounding Science Fiction while she was in her mid-20s. Both Jackson and Highsmith achieved their first publications in mainstream periodicals during tweenhood. Jackson wrote a poem called The Pine Tree that won a contest in Junior Home magazine when she was only 12 years old. And Highsmith's letters to her parents from summer camp were published in Women's World magazine at the same age. Jackson and Highsmith became stars of their college literary magazines, publishing stories that would serve as the foundation for their more mature work. College students, you can do it, right? That's your foundation. But each struggled after graduation to get a foot in the door of the thriving periodical industry of the period. Despite some successes, neither could place their sui generis works in the slicks, even long after the success of their early books raised their respective profiles, and thus they often resorted to publication in genre magazines. In contrast, Brackett focused mainly on these specialized periodicals, especially pulp magazines. Brackett was one of the few women publishing in the male-dominated crime and sci-fi industries, and her gender-ambiguous name likely mitigated discrimination to some degree until she became better known, though she usually claimed that she never personally experienced any significant sex-based prejudice. And while there were many successful crime and mystery writers during this era, many successful female crime and mystery writers during this era, few made use of the hard-boiled style that Brackett and Highsmith adapted to their own ends. The most significant challenge when comparing this particular trio is the varying degrees to which each of these writers has already been reclaimed by the critical establishment. Jackson now is finally a well-established brand. All of her writing for adults is in print, and 2 volumes of her uncollected work have been released. 2 biographies devoted to the author have been published, and a volume of her letters came out in 2021. So I've got a newer edition of sort of like expensive edition of Haunting of Hill House, the letters that came out recently, finally, a couple of adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House. Don't get me started on Mike Flanagan, but if you want to talk about this after, we can. There's a movie called Shirley that's based on a novel that's a fictionalization of her life, if you can keep track of that. But Elizabeth Moss is perfect as Shirley Jackson. And then this is a collection that came out recently called When Things Get Dark, that are stories inspired by Shirley Jackson with some of the biggest genre writers of the current crop of writers. Okay. Highsmith has been subject to similar popular interests. 3 biographies have been written about her life. Her novels were reissued by W.W. Norton in the 1990s, and the recent publication of excerpts from her diaries and notebooks, as well as a documentary about her life, has confirmed her status as a cultural icon. She has also been claimed as a major, if problematic, figure of the LGBTQ+ history. Such interest, though, tends to focus more on Highsmith's personality than on her writing. Too often, the critical consensus agrees she produced half a dozen masterful books, a bunch of middling ones, and a few clunkers. And so she was regarded as good for a crime writer. These latent biases are also found in literary scholarship. Most analysis of her writing treats it within genre studies of crime writing as career literature. Though Highsmith's body of work does offer a distinct spin on both of these categories, such an approach limits her to an also-ran status that plagues so many genre writers. She's rarely studied alongside authors outside of the crime genre, and her broader literary influence has been mostly ignored. So this is a graphic novel that's based on her early New York life. This is the documentary about partly about her life and about her relationships with women. This is her diaries and notebooks that came out recently, a collection of those. And then she's by far the most adapted for film, and we could talk about why that is, probably because it's crime, right? And crime movies sell. But this is the newest one. This is the Ripley series that came out. I've tried to start it. I need to give it another chance, but it was a little not quite up my alley. Carol's gorgeous. It's a great movie, great adaptation of her pulp novel. And then Deepwater, I haven't even tried because I don't want to. Ben Affleck, like I could tell by the casting, it just wasn't going to be my thing. So, but good for them. Good for the Highsmith estate for making that money. Leigh Brackett is by far the least known of the trio. I had a hard time finding images for this slide, just to give you a sense, at least in literary circles. Among Star Wars fans, she's known as the writer of the first draft of the screenplay for The Empire Strikes Back. And sci-fi enthusiasts know her as an important foremother, the queen of the space opera, though most of her work is no longer in print. But recognition of Brackett beyond her prominence as a writer of crime and science fiction, not to mention as a screenwriter of classic genre films, I didn't end up including The Big Sleep, she wrote with William Faulkner. The Long Goodbye was her last film. The Rio Bravo, right? Like some of these great genre films she had her name on, and a lot of people don't realize. Of these 3 writers, she was the most faithful to genre conventions and worked almost exclusively with publishers in the booming mid-century industries of both crime and sci-fi fields. This may explain why her name is now the least known of the three. The fact that Brackett chose to live in both Los Angeles and rural Ohio further detached her from the monolith that was the post-war New York literary industry. Yet she offers important contributions to this study because even her most genre-faithful works are playful and creative in their use of standard conventions, as well as her incorporation of tropes and techniques from other categories of literary text. Her treatment of gender is more nuanced than has traditionally been acknowledged in the limited range of her work. I've got a bug. It's very interested in what I'm talking about. So this Best of Lee Brackett was a collection that came out during her lifetime. It was edited by her husband, and he wrote the introduction. You occasionally can find these collections of short stories, but they're very cheap, and they were made like back in the 60s and the 70s. But this is a more recent, her best known work is a dystopian novel called The Long Tomorrow. That's kind of about post-nuclear life among the Amish. And it is a little bit more respected. It's her more literary, people call it. But you can get her original screenplay, her version, before it got adapted a lot it got edited a lot by George Lucas. And when I went to her archive in New Mexico a couple summers ago, I got to see all of her notes from her meeting with George Lucas, where like she named the ice planet Hoth, and like they had all these conversations about like who were Luke and Leia going to hook up, that type of thing. So, but I wasn't supposed to take pictures because of Disney, right? Like Disney would not allow that. So, and then the only other thing, like I found this, and I think it might be like from a like Lee Brackett and them in Hamilton Day in their hometown in Ohio, where they lived for a long time. But otherwise, she just definitely hasn't been commemorated much at all, which I think is a bummer. Did I go too far? Did I skip a slide? Yeah. Okay. Another important commonality between all three of these women was, of course, their race. All three were white, which gave them a privileged point of view within the Jim Crow era of America's literary history. As white women, these writers work from a distinct racial subject position, though one that is mostly neglected in consideration of their work, in part because of their engagement with issues of race were less explicit. Though Jackson focused almost exclusively on white female protagonists, she was the most interested of the three in addressing racial themes, especially in her short stories. The gendered anxiety that her female characters feel is often rooted in the same sense of threat implicit in racial hierarchies of the time. Though the segregationist philosophies, whether based in formal government segregation or in more informal and often voluntary social divisions, were often justified as a means to protect this group of women, Jackson shows how the encoded ideology of racial difference only exacerbated the same sense of threat. While Brackett's crime fiction sometimes includes the kind of racial stereotyping that was typical of the genre at the time, she was more likely to address the issues of extreme discrimination in her science fiction writing, whether overtly or through metaphors of otherness that were central to the genre, and both her sci-fi and her Western works emphasize the rights of indigenous peoples. In contrast, Highsmith was notoriously and belligerently held on to many of the prejudices of her Southern upbringing, and she became increasingly racist and bigoted in her beliefs as she aged. Yet, her treatment of an obsession with the hegemonic white male of the period should be regarded as offering its own significant reflections on the nature of racial privilege in mid-century America. Thus, while race rarely constitutes the main subject of these writers' work, and while racial discrimination was not one of the challenges they faced when engaging with the literary marketplace, maintaining a focus on the less visible ways that race influenced their depictions of sociocultural dynamics is necessary in order to keep their own privileges visible. Just as this era of literary history has often been written as a masculine one, highlighting the racial homogeneity that is so often a part of this narrative offers another way to add depth to this important counterhistory of post-war American literature. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to make sure I didn't skip any other slides. I did. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is from Chapter 1, Gender and Genre. When Patricia Highsmith published her first novel, Strangers on a Train, in 1950, she quickly earned accolades as one of the most intriguing new writers of suspense fiction in America. After this early success, her subsequent work over the next 3 decades was published, marketed, and judged within that generic framework, much to her dismay. That Highsmith did not set out to write strangers in any particular genre, and that her work to this point had appeared exclusively in women's magazines like Harper's Bazaar and Women's Home Companion, seemed to matter little to the critics and readers. This pigeonholing was not an uncommon experience for authors in post-war America. And so I have the first edition of Strangers on a Train, the American version and the British version, which you can see, like, you put a gun on the cover, you probably know it's going to be crime or suspense or something similar, right? But then increasingly, after it was so popular, when it gets reprinted, they really play up that element. And I've got another example of the way they marketed her later works in a different slide coming up. Okay. Since the 1920s, proliferating periodicals from pulps like Spicy Detective, Weird Tales, and Planet Stories, to mainstream but still literary mags such as The New Yorker, to the slicker but still specialized publications that took over in the 1960s, seem to suggest that clear, easily identifiable boundaries existed between various genres and subgenres. Within a specific genre's fandom, writers could achieve a certain level of prominence that would allow them to establish a stable career, no mean feat for artists of any period. But for writers that did not want to be restricted to a single genre, or for those who felt a more general or sought a more general literary credibility, such designations often felt like the kiss of death, as these labels tended to limit critical understanding of their work, as well as the venues available for publication. Even outside of the specialized periodical world, the post-war publishing industry catered to both literary and popular fiction with similarly rigid, if less visible classifications. These taxonomies reign despite the fact that, as Alistair Fowler puts it, genre is much less of a pigeonhole than a pigeon. That is, it should be treated as a way to open up a text and to consider its nuances and meaning, not to limit its possibilities for interpretation and circulation. And so in this chapter, I talk a little bit about how the publishing industry accommodated or didn't accommodate for writers like these three that I'm looking at. And these are some of the more demure covers that I could find to share in a professional setting. Yeah, just so you know. All right. In studies of the concept of genre, the most fundamental principle may at first seem to be one of limitation, but the term, like its peer in this study, gender, derives from the French for a kind and Latin for class. Genre distinctions therefore establish not just clear boundaries, but also affinities between categories of writing, and genre designations can be useful for writers, critics, and readers alike. Skilled authors are in command of the conventions with which they work, especially if they wish to be accepted by specialist publications and publishers, or conversely, if they wish to adapt the genre to a new end. Such restrictions then can foster creativity rather than snuffing it out. When certain qualities of a text are predetermined, writers can give their inventiveness free rein within those boundaries, or find inspiration in devising new ways to fulfill generic requirements. In addition to exerting various degrees of influence on the writing process of a particular text, genres are, as Frederick Jameson describes, social contracts between a writer and a specific public. Whether a book advertises its genre on the cover or whether it deploys subtly coded elements of genre within its narrative, the categorization mediates the reader's expectation and influences both understanding of a text meaning and also a cultural positioning of the work more generally. Such groupings can help readers and critics seek out work of a certain type more easily, as well as to make useful comparisons between similar texts. And just as a single example of genre is necessarily connected to a larger generic discourse, genres are also embedded in a larger system of cultural meaning. They rely on symbols of culture, but also shape those symbols in both normative and subversive ways, depending on the author and the approach. Genre is thus inward focus, operating according to a set of rules established by the text, but also outward focus, connected to the matrix of cultural meaning larger than either the specific text or even its genre. A more dynamic and, I argue, accurate treatment of genre would take both literary and cultural patterns of influence into account and would treat genre analysis as organically integrated with the other noteworthy components of a text. Though we have traditionally sought to pretend that the canon is determined purely by artistic merit, we have become increasingly aware of the many factors that go into deciding a text's literary worth. Most importantly, for the purpose of this study, designations of genre play a major part in this process, and that criterion is inextricably linked with several potentially disqualifying factors, including mainstream popularity and gender. Despite the clear benefits in taking a broader, more inclusive view of literary history, namely including the full scope of what was really being written and published, thus providing a more accurate view of the way art responds to its historical moment, the desire of academics and publishers to enforce generic boundaries within the canon persists. In fact, the hierarchy that distinguishes genre tends to be most contentious when such distinctions carry assumptions about quality or value. Association with certain critically acclaimed genres, such as the experimental novel or the epic poem, may imbue a sense of inherent worth or literariness, whereas being linked to more malign genres like romance or fantasy may disqualify a work completely, no matter the quality of composition. So, while a few authors and a limited number of examples of genre writing have snuck into the canon, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's innovative detective stories, Herman Melville's picaresque sea yarns, and Ray Bradbury's allegorical science fiction, to name a few. Genre fiction is usually treated as little more than that which we judge true art against, and thus is so disadvantaged that it is unlikely to make it into any but the most inclusive of canons. And I deliberately picked the literary cover on the left, and then a cover that makes it seem like it clearly fits into the pulp end of things, right? So Weird Tales is a pulp magazine that love them some Edgar Allan Poe. There's this great line of Classics Illustrated that take like classic novels and make them into comic books. And so this is one of Herman Melville's works. And then obviously the Martian Chronicles, or I could have even picked Fahrenheit, right? Like these Ray Bradbury books that have sort of spanned both ends of that spectrum. In general, a work that comes to be regarded as literarily significant is one that is both reflective of its time and also universally resonant. Though relevance can be achieved in any number of ways, within the category of fiction, the label is most bestowed on texts that we might lump together as realist, or what Fowler calls the verisimilar novel, even if that attempt to capture real life is done in a more experimental way. The flexibility of this term likely explains why it can so easily be equated with a work of literature that has no other obvious markers of genre. Over time, the concept of realism has accumulated a variety of associations and thus can stretch to fit any space it is given. Interestingly, the queer writer Highsmith called these less genre-forward works straight novels, and noted how such distinctions both create and enforce arbitrary value judgments. She surmised that the straight novel is valued over genre fiction like her own, as it is, quote, automatically assumed to be more serious, important, and worthwhile because it is a straight novel, and because the author is assumed to have a serious intent in writing it, end quote. As Highsmith implies, the verisimilitude of these works tends to obscure, for the average reader at least, its step to genre, and thus it is treated as somehow more serious and original than explicitly genre-based writing, thereby raising its status. Skip ahead a little bit just for the sake of time. So thinking about how these things intersect with gender. Significantly, when the writers of genre works are women, they are even less likely to make the canonical cut because genre and gender biases tend to correlate. Gender, like genre, has been treated as both an explicit and implicit means of classifying literature, one that too often segregates women's writing to the point that it has been neglected or forgotten. In mid-20th century in particular, as Anna Critic asserts, quote, gender was one of the axes on which the high-low cultural distinctions would continue to turn, end quote. In effect, gender can become a genre all its own, both as a way of bringing together works with commonalities of content, style, and vision, but also as a label that can lead to discrimination against those same texts. Whereas certain hegemonic categories have been treated as invisible or even illegible, masculinity, heterosexuality, and whiteness most significantly, association with more visible or legible categories tends to lead a work to be regarded as somehow niche and thus treated as not representative of the American experience in its broadest sense. Similarly, some genres may be divided into acceptable and unacceptable categories, and these distinctions are often tied to more general cultural biases like sexism. Women writers were traditionally restricted to genres that were believed to align with the realms of experience considered appropriate for their gender and station. Romances, regionalism, and social issue novels became important mediums for representing female experience, but the dominance of women in these genres also caused their literary statuses to be diminished. And because genre writing, whatever that meant in a given period, tended to be considered as automatically less worthy, women's relegation to such forms left them doubly disadvantaged. Take, for example, the grudging respect that has been won for hard-boiled and not coincidentally masculine forms of crime fiction. Whereas the cozy crime fiction subgenre, in which female authors have often excelled, is considered inferior by some. And I deliberately picked covers that make my point, but also it wasn't that hard, right? Like I could have picked many, many different covers that would have made the exact same point. Likewise, when a male author, anyone from F. Scott Fitzgerald to Jonathan Franzen, writes about family life, these works may be treated as candidates for the Great American Novel, whereas female writers who cover the same subject matter from a female point of view will likely be relegated to labels of domestic or women's fiction, much more niche categories. As fluid and malleable as both the categories of gender and genre could be, they have generally been deployed in restrictive ways, and stubbornly persistent divisions have disadvantaged women writers whose content may not be considered as inherently significant. And skipping ahead. Critics and scholars have shown a similarly limited imagination, and thus works that delve in minute detail into 19th century whaling industry, Moby Dick, or personal narratives about one young unmarried man trying to live mostly alone in the woods, Walden, are regarded as ruminations on the human condition that should be read by everyone, whereas stories about motherhood or female self-determination are more likely to be considered niche works meant only for female audiences. Because genres are historically contingent, most will change and adapt over time, but they also carry forward the baggage of their history if critics and authors do not deliberately work to eradicate biases. The multifaceted nature of judgments against genre writing is perhaps why it is so difficult to reclaim them once they have been stigmatized. In essence, we're not just revising cultural opinion about a particular set of generic conventions, but also the beliefs about language, art, and culture to which those conventions are tied. And because the associations between these values are not always obvious, a good deal of digging is necessary to root out the source of such prejudices. For this reason, individual writers and specific works are more easily reclaimed than whole categories, and framing certain cases as exceptional can be more efficient than proving the merits of a genre as a whole. And I think I have just one more example and then I'll finish up. I'm going to apply these ideas to the three writers that I studied. So, amid the confusion of the post-war marketplace, efforts to distinguish new writers by promoting genre associations could backfire, as happened with Jackson's increasingly exaggerated media association with witchcraft and the supernatural. No two of her novels are alike, and she published in a wide range of periodicals, from her career breakthrough in The New Yorker to women's magazines with which her name became associated to science fiction magazines. As her career progressed, this variety of output, which should have been considered a marker of her incredible range and creative skill, caused publishers to struggle with how to market her work as a cohesive brand. Though her first novel, which I have there, The Road Through the Wall, 1948, was a realist novel that fit rather comfortably within a post-war marketplace that was moving away from modernism, promotional materials written by her husband emphasized her talents as an authority on witchcraft and magic, and called her, quote, perhaps the only contemporary writer who is a practicing amateur witch, specializing in small-scale black magic and fortune-telling with a tarot deck. Shirley refused to write her own promotional materials because she found it too uncomfortable. So I think her husband might have done this to kind of troll her. Like, he wrote it for her, but then he kind of forced her to live with it, and it's become part of her legacy at this point. Her reputation soon became based around what was originally something of a joke, leading to articles like the one from 1949 titled "Shirley Jackson is Sure Enough Witch." And this is another one. This is another one from later, and it starts with the magic has been woven around the literary personality of Shirley Jackson. The whole thing is like, later on it says, to the uncosmological eye, Miss Jackson, qua Miss Jackson, looks not only wholesome, also very much on the day side, right? So like this, all these articles became about sort of saying, oh, she's not as scary as we thought she was, right? Hi. So while Jackson did show a deep scholarly interest in the subject, she became, as her biographer Ruth Franklin notes, quote, embarrassed by the witchcraft talk, and preferred to instead to present herself to reporters and critics, virtually all of whom were men, as a women's magazine certified happy homemaker who tossed off her stories during breaks from dusting. And this is a promotional photo from one of the profiles that a newspaper did, and I think it's representative. It's her with her 4 kids all sort of lined up with her, and so she would often take photos. But she became partly her best selling work was her collection of memoirs about being a mom, and so people have talked about this sort of schizophrenic difference between those two, but really there's a lot of crossover that scholars have been doing some interesting work showing how they align. So despite her personal preferences, her witchy image would dog her for the rest of her life, as when her publisher sought to promote her 1954 novel, The Bird's Nest, as a horror story. In response, Jackson complained in frustration that she saw it as more akin to Moby Dick, quote, penetrating to the depths of the human heart and whatnot. End quote. That and whatnot is just so typically Shirley Jackson. It's one of my favorite quotes about her. But a novel centered on a young woman, especially one that merged elements of crime fiction, Bildungsroman, and psychological realism, was not judged to have the kind of universal appeal necessary to break through in such a marketplace. So Farrar Straus and Company played up her reputation for thrills and chills in order to garner interest. So this is the full for the first edition of her work. And you can say over here, it's talking about like the horror of the experience. They are playing up the sort of fear element, but then they try to balance that by having all these quotes about her other work to like, both the Life Among the Savages is talking about her as her quiet wit and resigned humor, right? And then,
The Christian Science Monitor.
Yes, Christian Science Monitor. Her mom was a Christian Scientist, so I think it's part. But then these other ones are talking about like her literariness, so it seems like they're kind of trying to have it all ways, right? So they're promoting it as a sort of like freaky horror novel, but then also trying to say, but she's a serious writer, we swear, right? Like, see how serious this cover looks, right? So it's interesting to see how they're trying to walk that line. Highsmith was similarly pigeonholed as a genre writer in American publishing circles, which led her work to be judged and often misunderstood according to those limited criteria for most of her career, much to her chagrin. In her 1983 guide to writing suspense fiction, she could not help but rail against the strictures that had long plagued her. She writes that, quote, the suspense label, which American booksellers, and American reviewers are so fond of, is only a handicap to the imagination of young writers, like any category, just like any arbitrary law. Though her first novel, Strangers, she reports, was just a novel when I wrote it, it was labeled a suspense novel upon publication, and, quote, from that time on, whatever I wrote was put in the suspense category, which means to have one's novels faded, at least at the start of one's writing career, to no more than 3-inch reviews in the newspaper, squeezed in among good and bad novels by hack writers that get the same brief treatment. End quote. And so you can see she's right about that, right? So I showed you The Strangers on a Train. They had the gun, but it wasn't necessarily otherwise coded as any particular genre. But these are her next 4 novels. I think I skipped a couple too, but all of them talk about thriller, a Harper novel of suspense, right? Like all of them are sort of playing that up once her name became an acknowledged brand. And she was never really able to get outside of that. But her association with the genre may have attracted fans to this type of writing to her work, and her unconventional approach, less whodunit than whydunit, as Eric Targan describes, may have opened the path for future crime writers. In contrast, Brackett embraced genre publishing and was more than willing to work within its conventions, an approach that made her a big name in an industry whose voracious appetite meant that she could almost always find a place to sell her work. I will say she wasn't ever particularly paid well, and that's part of why she had to produce so much, right? If you're going to publish in the pulps, you had to produce a lot and constantly, and so being in 2 genres helped her to do that. Yet when she tried her hand at more realist fiction, such as her unpublished novel Golden Land, about the struggles of a Pennsylvania family who moves west to her home state of California, she was rejected. In a rather harsh report written in September 1950, Cecil Golbick, an editor at Howard McCann who published her first crime novel, describes the manuscript as a failure of an allegory with too many flat characters. He claims the novel would need a complete rewrite to be considered for publication. Students, do you feel better? At least your comments that you're getting on your writing isn't this bad. He claims the novel would need a complete rewrite to be considered for publication, though he warns, quote, I'm not sure it would be worth the effort required, right? As he feels certain that acceptance by any publisher would be unlikely. Interestingly, the characters in the draft available in Brackett's archive are no less developed than those found in her first novel, and so Golbick seems to judge this more realist novel by different standards than the work of hard-boiled crime fiction that the publisher previously accepted. And I pulled this, so these are, I mentioned some of, like, just to show you the range of publication, right? The sort of classic works for both her Planet Story stuff, which goes toward the more pulpy end, and then she wrote a novel that was based on the screenplay for Rio Bravo. But this is a letter from the same editor that I found in her archive. I should make it clear, no one has ever talked about this novel that exists. And it's a partial novel that I think she gave up when she got the terrible criticism, but it's the type of thing where, like, when you find it in the archives, you realize there's an entirely different story about Brackett that should be written, right? Like, she was trying to do mainstream stuff. She tried to send her work to mainstream publishers, but anything that's been written about her so far said she didn't want to. She didn't try, right? It's just that when she did try, no one really took her seriously. So this is not the letter I was talking about, but it's from the same guy, and I just had to include it because just to show the type of sexism that women were working with during this period. He talks about, like, oh yeah, your script come. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but sure, I'll get around to it. And he says at one point, his sign off. The publicity department showed me your photograph. Margot told me you were attractive, but I didn't dream you were that attractive. This is one professional to another, right? And this is relatively staid compared to what a lot of people had to deal with. So ultimately, then, whether we regard genre associations as an asset or a liability for these writers, tracking this element should be an essential component of any analysis of their work. Rather than relegating authors to niche categories, genre can, as I seek to demonstrate, create useful and fruitful connections between them. And so just to show you one example of one of my chapters, I picked science fiction because it's the only genre that all 3 of them wrote in. Most of my other chapters are comparing 2 of the writers, except for women's fiction, which Lee Brackett published a crime story in Cosmopolitan back when it was known for its crime fiction. There was a brief time when Cosmo was known for publishing crime writers in the 60s, right before Helen Gurley Brown and the Cosmo girl became a thing. But so they all publish in science fiction, but only Lee Brackett has really been written about as a science fiction writer. And so you can see one of my favorite stories of her is called The Black Amazon of Mars. But when people talk about her science fiction, they usually say it's misogynist. She's just trying to write like a man. And that's a feminist critic that said that she's just trying to write in this way like a man. And there are some of her works that you could potentially read like that. But I feel like you also have to acknowledge these works like Black Amazon of Mars, right? Which is about he became a recurring character in many of her works named Stark, who goes to a planet and is like fighting this person who's wearing a mask. And then she suddenly gets her mask taken off and they realize that the general is a woman. And so she like pauses. There's like an awkward moment for a second where everyone looks at each other and then she just goes into battle and all the men turn around and follow her. So it ends up being like her gender is never really an issue, except for like there's some smooching later on because it is space opera. So you have to have some romance going on. But it's also like there's this great scene where the two of them turn their backs together and fight the enemy. And so he just accepts her as a warrior very quickly, you know? And so I think there's all these other interesting stories that she wrote that are about female characters trying to explain things to men, like male characters that, especially in science fiction, that believe in the nature of progress or think that they understand how things work. And these female characters are trying to say like, well, what about this? And they're like, no. And then usually the female character dies. But again, you know, conventions of the genre. I brought in Big Jump. It's one of my favorite of hers because it's basically a noir crime novel set in space. And it's fantastic and out of print, just like all of her books are out of print. And then, so that's how I sort of reread her work. I look at the crime intersection and then her female characters, which I think are so important. And then the middle two are Shirley Jackson. She published in the Magazine of Science, Fantasy and Science Fiction. She was a big fan of fantasy and science fiction. She was paid for her contributions by a lifetime subscription to the magazine, which she thought was hilarious. And she was like, it's fine, I would have read them anyway, right? But these are stories that if you go to her archives at the Library of Congress, there are letters from her agent saying like, we've tried these everywhere and no one wants them, right? And they're all a little bit weird. And so they ended up in these magazines because they were thrilled. They were thrilled to have a Shirley Jackson in their work and they could put her name on the cover. And one of her stories ended up getting picked for a best short story of the year in those collections that they did, which is sort of surprising that they would go to a sci-fi collection to pick a work. So it was good for them too. And then Highsmith, again, never has been treated that way, but those who were in my class, we read one. She loves snails. She was a big sort of a snail freak. She would like put them in her bra when she traveled internationally so that they could come with her places. But so she has like that type of thing, which ended up in the Saturday Evening Post, weirdly enough. So she published in the Saturday Evening Post. And it's actually, I was really excited when I got a copy of the Saturday Evening Post. The ending was different than the one in her collection of short stories. So it was clear that like she capitulated to the editor's demands. And if I can ever get to the Saturday Evening Post archive, I'm hoping I can find some explanation of that. But she also has all these stories. So she published another story in Gamma, which was a more contemporary, the market started shifting at a certain point, and some of these earlier pulp magazines folded. So this is a later version. And then she has various works. Her first short story collection had 3 what I would call science fiction stories in it. And then later she published this one called Tales of Natural and Unnatural Catastrophes, which is basically all sci-fi. So it's one of those things where you can't understand why she wasn't considered in this way unless we just had these sort of preconceptions about what kind of writer she was, right? And unlike Brackett, those stories really don't include crime at all. She's not playing with crime conventions. It's just this totally other part of her brain that she was interested in looking. She liked stories about animals too, and some of those could probably be considered sci-fi as well. So this is sort of what I'm trying to do. I cover women's magazine fiction, sci-fi, crime writing. I give Lee Brackett her own chapter on crime writing because people don't know as much about her. Gothic. And so I'm trying to sort of look at these intersections and say, these are all the same writers. Why are we only treating them in this one specific way? And also, if Jackson can be incorporated into the canon beyond just The Lottery, which I'm sure many of you read, the short story that sort of made her name and started her career, then why can't these other writers be brought along as well? So that's the main idea. That's all.
Excellent. Dr. Lawson has so quickly agreed to answer some questions. So if you all have any questions, please feel free.
Yeah. I should have known when I mentioned that there was going to be a follow-up. Yeah.
When you first brought that up, I thought you meant maybe she went places, saw different interesting snails she'd never seen before and brought them back. But
No, she just liked snails. And I think maybe some of her short stories indicate she probably was buying the ones that are meant for food and then just keeping them. But she cultivated them, and a couple of her characters are also obsessed with snails. So it's this sort of like she thought they were interesting. She named them. She would write very descriptive passages about them copulating and like talk about. She was fascinated by the reproductive capabilities. But she also has one of her short stories that I don't know if it'd be sci-fi or dystopian fiction, but a guy gets obsessed with snails. He starts cultivating and then forgets about them and ends up being smothered by them because they propagate so fast. So I think she also understood the downside of her particular passion. But it's one of those things about her that gets sort of played up as being very weird, but she was kind of an animal lover in general. So yeah, hi.
Sounds like in your research you are disappointed to find books that were out of print that you thought were marvelous, etc. What kind of advocacy is needed, or how does one go about the process of trying to find a publisher who can bring these to the public?
I had a really interesting conversation with the librarian who oversees the Lee Brackett Archive about this. And I asked her, because many people contact her because that's where a lot of these manuscripts are. She and her husband did not have kids. There wasn't necessarily a clear sort of like legacy for who was going to get the rights and who would be in control. Jackson's kids, she had 4 kids. They're very involved. Her grandson did a graphic novel of the lottery, which we have at our library at Wesleyan if you're interested in seeing it. Her son and her daughter edited that collection of letters, right? So they're very involved. There was no one to step in. Patricia Highsmith had a sort of friend, and she sort of appointed an executor before she died. So the librarian in New Mexico said, basically, it's her agent, like the agency that was in charge of her. And so they will not respond to emails. Like even the library, they won't respond to emails. They won't respond to phone calls. And so basically, because they don't think it worth giving the rights out, then people just aren't. And there have been a few republications and things like that, but I'm not sure all of them are legal, number one. And number two, they're very small presses, so they'll do a really limited run and you can find them used, but they're not necessarily continuing them in publication. So I would guess I would have to go knock on someone's door, which I'm willing to do. Like at a certain point, I've exhausted all my other options, so they better be ready to see me. Because I just think it's one of those things where, like, especially now with the revival of Star Wars, right? Like that Star Wars is such a big deal. That not to mention just like the importance of sci-fi in the culture, you know. And she wrote a really interesting. Her only original piece of Western fiction was about a mixed race man who was a cowboy during, I can't remember what era, but so she took a weird, sort of like an interesting, unusual perspective on any of the genres she was writing about. So I would love to be the person to do that, but I have a feeling I'm gonna need an army. Volunteers accepted, right? Yeah. So it's an interesting question. Yeah. Any other questions?
Do you know when the earliest stuff will pass into the public domain? Because at that point, presumably one could.
Her early crime stories were published in the late 30s.
So
not too long. I don't know the world's still going to be around at that point, but you know, assuming we make it that far, yeah. Well, and it's interesting too because you can actually find her. I mean, because there were so many pulp versions of her work, if you go to used bookstores or any place online, you can often find them. But there were different versions, and like the version that was in the pulp magazine isn't always the same version as the one she published in the Ace paperbacks. And so it's sort of like one of those things, like to be a completist requires a lot of work. But a lot of those are up. A lot of the pulp magazines are up on Internet Archive. If you're curious, you can just go and you get a free account and you can go and you can see them like all scanned in there. And it's so interesting to look at them too in comparison, the ads that are alongside of them and that type of thing. But yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It made research a lot easier in this particular field. Any other questions about snails? Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Have you found that it's improved at all for women in the gender, sort of categorization and genres, or no?
Since that time. You know, I don't think in my interlit studies class today we talked about book talk because we're talking about like contemporary topics, and I think alternate forms of review and promotion have been developing in a way that have gotten rid of some of the gatekeepers that have traditionally tried to say, like, Jonathan Franzen is the only one who matters, right? Like, so there are all these people that are saying, like, these novels are important and these novels are interesting otherwise. And so more and more female writers are becoming popular, but whether they're getting the sort of literary credibility when they're, especially when they're writing in certain types of genre, I think that's sort of left to be seen. I love Jane Ann Phillips, and I like that she wrote this sort of gothic-y novel, but she's won, you know, multiple times, right? It's like, and there's a lot of people doing similar work to her that aren't getting necessarily the name. In my afterword, I have a list of, like, I think 15 women writers of different nationalities and coming from different places that are writing right now that I feel like could be the next Shirley Jackson. So I feel like it's different than it was for them. People are acknowledging now that women are by far a greater reading cohort. They're the ones buying the books. So I'm hoping that money will talk. But I, you know, again, like, the publishing industry is sort of like collating into 4 major publishers, and, you know, so it's,
Mostly male editors, probably publishers.
yeah, or terribly underpaid young women who end up not being able to stay in the career long enough if they're not independently wealthy. It's another issue with the industry right now too. So I think yes, but the bar was very low, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh yes, Deb.
It's interesting, you mentioned Jane Ann and her gothic, but that's like her 7th or 8th novel. And if she'd come out and said, this is what I'm doing in, what, 1979 when Black Dickens came out, that was her first book.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see what her drew. She was starting.
I do.
A kind of privilege, as you know, with authors that write serious works and then like play with genre.
Yeah, I think Colson Whitehead's another great example. Like, he's done zombie novels, he's done speculative fiction about slavery, he's done crime fiction. He now has a recurring crime character, which is another trope of the genre that, like, not a lot of the literary people do. So I feel like anytime someone like him, who has incredible credibility and popularity, deigns to write in the genre, he's bringing everyone up with him, right? And showing that it can be done. So we just need to, again, get away from that idea of it's good for a science fiction novel, right? Like, the sort of, like, caveats that we're constantly using to talk about these things, I think often, and I do it too, you know, like, and I had to, like, go carefully through my book and make sure I wasn't, like, criticizing or denigrating the genres as I was trying to talk about them, because there is a lot of crap out there, you know, like, it can be very formulaic and it can be very poorly written, but that's not just genre writing. Like, all types of writing have that as well. So
it's really a shame that so many of these works only get considered serious. I mean, what a great service you've done with this book. But
well, I mean, a $60 small academic press book, I don't know,
but it's out there. And then
Yeah.
the next, you know, Dr. Ashley Lawson, who is looking for resources, is going to find it because that book is out there. Right? It is a service, and I'm totally impressed. But I was thinking about something else that I got distracted on now.
Well, I was going to say, like, the website Crime Reads contacted my publisher and wanted to publish an excerpt of. They published an excerpt of my book. No one told me about it. I just saw it in the newsletter and realized I'd been excerpted. But it is interesting that they're the ones that express the interest, right? Like this, and they do great things. It's one of my favorite websites because they're constantly covering, like, I'm getting recommendations, and they do interesting things with sort of like crossover genres and things like that. But it would be interesting to me to see if not my book, a book like my book gets reviewed in some of the more general publications.
What I was going to say is I was thinking about people like Ursula K. Le Guin and Madeleine L'Engle and women that were writing and selling a ton of books, but were genre writers who are now kind of being regarded as, especially Ursula K. Le Guin, is being regarded as just a seminal figure.
And we have to give credit to the, like, 1970s and 80s feminist critics who were the first ones to look at these works and say, like, this is the important literature of our time period. And now we look back and we're like, well, crap, you're right. Like, this stuff is sticking around. It's still resonant. But they were the ones who were, like, not getting tenure at their institutions because they were writing about sci-fi, right? And I think too, we need to have more academic support for sci-fi fiction classes, like writing, and from the creative writing side, right? Crime fiction classes, like the craft side of things, to argue that this isn't just like repeating a formula, but there's a real art to it. And I think once the institution supports that more as well, then some of these other things will follow too. Teach the youths. Let them lead the way.
Doug mentioned the names of other writers, but I was just thinking about increased interest in people like Octavia Butler who are writing speculative fiction.
Mhm.
If increased interest in their work does anything to, I mean, clearly these works are still out of print, but doesn't do anything to, I don't know, lend credibility to their genre.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, the fact that they get to be big names, not just in the sci-fi industry, right? Because I think, again, that's sort of where they were relegated for a long time. And it's not that the sci-fi industry isn't hardcore and supportive, and there's a lot of like fan support from that side. But again, they sort of like their reach gets limited. They're not put in the Norton Anthology, you know, although I think Octavia Butler is now one of the ones in there. So it is, and I think, you know, it's one of those that I do think the more people that are acknowledged as just good crafts people, right, that will, it won't matter what genre they write in, right? They're doing original, beautifully written things in any genre that they want to tackle. I think film's helping with it too, right? The elevation of like horror and things like that to Oscar winning levels, that's only going to change people's minds from that side too. So I'm all for it.
Do you think gender is now the only barrier? The fact that things like Marvel properties and Star Wars and everything they've become massively mainstream compared to where they were even 20 years ago. Is that?
Oh, you mean like because they're comic book properties?
Yeah,
and
and then you tend to be like a male-driven audience and male producing, or that people who get the biggest opportunities tend to be male
Right.
directors, male actors, male, you know. Is that the last hurdle? It's not necessarily the genre, but the
I think,
gender?
I think there's all sorts of, I mean, race, sexuality,
Well,
right?
of
Like,
course.
yeah. That there's, but I do think it's interesting when a Marvel movie features a woman or a person of color as a lead. It's always like, here's our woman movie, right? It's sort of like,
Yeah.
they sort of skew in that direction. You and I have talked about this so much because it's sort of, and so I think it'll be interesting when it's just like, here's a Marvel movie, right? And we're not gonna, because when the Marvels fails or when Ms. Marvel doesn't get as high of a box office, what the industry takes away from that is it's because it was a woman character and men didn't want to show up for the woman character, not it was just a shitty movie that people didn't necessarily, or were burnt out on comic book properties or things like that. So I think right now the main problem is that it's easy to blame these categories because, again, they're the legible part of the description, right? Like, it's not that it's a Marvel movie and we're sick to death of Marvel movies. I love Marvel movies, but I'm also saying, like, maybe we don't need 105 every year. Maybe the quality would be better if we reduced the output. But yeah, so it would be, you know, sort of acknowledging all the different things that can go into that potentially. Well, I think that's enough. I think we're very true.
There are books up there. Dr. Wilson has a good something for you, right?
Mhm.
Stick around. We have some snacks, some beverages, some refreshments. So thank you all for coming. Have a
Yeah,
great
thank you.
evening.
I also have postcards that have a discount code if you want to maybe think about getting the book later, because it is not cheap because it's an academic book. So feel free to take a postcard with you, or you just want to hang it up on your wall. Thank you. I always overthink your spelling of your name. Is it